It was a case that captivated the world. A story so chilling, so unbelievable, that it seemed impossible for the details to be true. In 2008, Casey Anthony became the focal point of one of the most infamous criminal cases in recent American history. Her 2-year-old daughter, Caylee Anthony, had disappeared without a trace, sparking a frantic search that would lead to an eventual discovery. A discovery that would turn the search for answers into one of the most contentious, emotional, and deeply troubling legal battles of the 21st century. The story of Caylee Anthony's disappearance began innocently enough. Casey, a 22-year-old single mother, reported her daughter missing on July 15, 2008. She claimed that her daughter had been kidnapped by a nanny, a woman she referred to as Zani the nanny, a figure who, as the investigation unfolded, was revealed to be entirely fictional. The timeline Casey provided was filled with holes, her story inconsistent. Yet, in those early days, the search for Caylee took center stage. Thousands of volunteers, media outlets, and law enforcement officers combed the streets of Orlando, Florida, in a desperate attempt to find the missing toddler. But behind the scenes, something darker was lurking. What seemed to be a mother's desperate plea for help was beginning to look more like the manipulative acts of someone hiding a terrible truth. As weeks passed, Casey's behavior became more troubling. Instead of focusing on the search for her daughter, she was seen partying with friends, attending bars, and even beginning a new relationship. Her actions were bizarre, to say the least. A mother whose child had vanished without a trace, yet she appeared to carry on with life as if nothing had happened. And it wasn't just her actions that were raising suspicion. As law enforcement and investigators dug deeper, they began to uncover the disturbing details of Casey's life, a life filled with lies, manipulation, and deceit. Her story about the kidnapping by Zani the nanny didn't add up. There was no nanny, no evidence of a kidnapping, and most tragically, no trace of little Caylee. Then, in December 2008, the worst fear became reality. Caylee's remains were found in a wooded area near her grandparents' home. A search that had begun with the hope of finding a missing child had now become a heart-wrenching discovery that confirmed the unthinkable. Caylee Anthony was dead. The world was left to ask one haunting question: who was responsible for her death? At first, the authorities were cautious. But as the details of Casey's life continued to unravel, they began to focus their investigation on her. She had been the last person to see Caylee alive. Her behavior in the weeks after the disappearance was suspicious. She was lying, withholding information, and evading responsibility. Eventually, it became clear the investigation wasn't just about finding Caylee. It was about uncovering the truth behind a mother who had seemingly lost all sense of accountability. The case became a media frenzy, with Casey Anthony emerging as one of the most polarizing figures in America. To some, she was a grieving mother. To others, she was a cold-blooded killer. The world watched as the investigation unfolded, and as the evidence mounted, it became increasingly clear that the truth would be even more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. This was no ordinary missing child case. It was a case of a mother who had seemingly manipulated the entire world, weaving a web of lies so intricate that it took investigators months to untangle. But the question still lingered: why? Why would a mother do such a thing? What drove Casey Anthony to commit an act so horrifying that it shook the very foundation of what we believe about family, love, and trust? As the truth would eventually come to light, one thing was clear: the manipulative lies of Casey Anthony had left a trail of destruction, one that would forever alter the course of her life and the lives of those around her. Before we dive into this unbelievable case, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so that you'll never miss any of the chilling cases we cover. Casey Marie Anthony seemed, on the surface, like any other young woman trying to make her way in the world. Born on March 19, 1986, in Warren, Ohio, she grew up in Orlando, Florida, the daughter of Cindy and George Anthony. But beneath the veil of what appeared to be a normal upbringing, there was a much darker story unfolding, one of deceit, manipulation, and an insatiable craving for attention. From a young age, Casey had a tendency to fabricate stories. Those who knew her described her as charming but secretive, someone who could easily manipulate a situation to get what she wanted. But this ability to weave lies wasn't just an occasional trait, it became a pattern that followed her into adulthood. Her family life, however, wasn't as perfect as it seemed. Cindy, her mother, was a controlling figure who had high expectations for her daughter. This created a toxic dynamic, with Cindy constantly trying to manage Casey's life, while Casey rebelled against the control. There were numerous reports of tension between the two, with Cindy reportedly believing that Casey was irresponsible and incapable of taking care of herself, let alone raising a child. But despite their rocky relationship, Casey was able to manipulate her family. She convinced them, time and time again, that everything was fine, that she was in control. She maintained an appearance of a loving mother to her daughter, Kaylee, and a respectable woman to her parents, all the while living a life full of lies and deceit. As she grew older, these lies only became more elaborate, culminating in a narrative so deeply ingrained in her psyche that she began to believe her own fabrications. At the same time, Casey sought out attention and validation from others. She thrived on the praise she received from her peers and friends, but it was never enough. Her need for admiration, combined with the frustration of being judged by her family, pushed her further into a world of delusion. Her desire to escape reality and live a carefree life became more pronounced. Instead of focusing on the responsibilities of motherhood, Casey longed for the freedom she had before becoming a parent. Freedom to party, to socialize, to live a life on her own terms. Motherhood, for Casey, became a burden she was unwilling to carry. In the months leading up to Kaylee's disappearance, Casey's behavior was a stark contrast to what one would expect from a loving mother. She was frequently seen out at bars, attending parties, and dating men, all the while telling her parents that she was working or taking care of her daughter. To those who knew her, Casey was seen as someone who had it all together, a social butterfly who seemed to be balancing life with ease. Yet beneath this exterior was a woman who was struggling with her own identity, a woman who resented the life that had been thrust upon her. Kaylee Marie Anthony was just 2 years old when her life was cruelly taken from her. Born on August 9, 2005, she was a vibrant, energetic toddler with a bright smile that could light up a room. To those who knew her, Kaylee was the very picture of innocence, playful, affectionate, and full of life. She was loved by her family, and despite the turmoil that surrounded her, she was the one constant source of joy in her mother, Casey Anthony's, life. But behind the seemingly perfect facade of motherhood that Casey presented to the world, the reality was much more troubling. Kaylee's life, as brief as it was filled with contradictions, and it is those contradictions that make her death so heart-wrenching. On the surface, Casey appeared to be a loving, doting mother. She often posted pictures of herself with Kaylee, showcasing a mother-daughter relationship that seemed strong and genuine. In public, Casey portrayed herself as a woman who had everything under control. She was a mother first, she claimed, and her world revolved around her daughter. However, as the investigation into Kaylee's disappearance unfolded, a darker picture emerged. Those who knew Casey best began to realize that the image she had crafted was nothing more than a carefully constructed lie. In reality, Casey seemed more focused on her own desires and personal life than on the well-being of her daughter. Reports surfaced of Casey regularly partying, going out with friends, and even entering into new relationships while her daughter's fate remained uncertain. What the world would later learn, and what Kaylee's tragic story would reveal, was that behind those seemingly loving photos and public displays of affection, Casey was leading a life full of deception. Kaylee, on the other hand, was completely unaware of the turmoil brewing around her. To her, her mother was everything, a source of love, protection, and guidance. Kaylee was a child full of life and promise, with her whole future ahead of her. She loved spending time with her mother and was described by those who knew her as a curious, joyful child who craved affection. The irony of the situation is staggering. Kaylee was the center of Casey's public persona. She was the symbol of Casey's motherly image, a child who was constantly shown in photos, who appeared to be loved by a mother who was doing everything in her power to care for her. But behind closed doors, Kaylee's life was a different story, one where she was nothing more than an obstacle to her mother's desires. As the days passed after Kaylee's disappearance, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. The search for Kaylee initially appeared to be the work of a grieving mother, but as Casey's lies piled up and the inconsistencies in her story were uncovered, investigators began to question everything. The search that began with the hope of finding a missing child soon turned into a grim and heartbreaking search for answers. And when Kaylee's remains were eventually found in December 2008, the world was confronted with the chilling truth. A child, whose life had been full of potential, had been taken too soon by the very person who was supposed to love and protect her. As the summer of 2008 unfolded, the world saw the emergence of a story filled with lies, manipulations, and deception. What was initially believed to be a heartbreaking tale of a missing child began to unravel, revealing the shocking truth behind the disappearance of Kaylee Anthony and the woman at the center of it all, Casey Anthony. It was July 15, 2008, when Casey Anthony reported her 2-year-old daughter, Kaylee, missing to the authorities. She claimed that Kaylee had been kidnapped by a nanny, a mysterious woman named Zani, a name that would become synonymous with Casey's web of lies. According to Casey's story, she had left Kaylee with this nanny, only to return later and find that both the nanny and her daughter had vanished. This version of events seemed strange from the very beginning, and the inconsistencies in Casey's story started to raise eyebrows. How could a mother not know the name of the person supposedly caring for her child? Why had Casey waited a month before reporting Kaylee's disappearance? Despite these questions, investigators initially pursued Casey's story with diligence. But soon, they began to notice strange things. Casey's behavior was out of place for a mother whose child was missing. Instead of focusing on the search for her daughter, she was seen partying with friends, attending bars, and spending time with men she had recently met. While investigators worked tirelessly to uncover any clues that could lead them to Kaylee, Casey continued to fabricate stories, weaving a tangled web of lies in order to maintain the appearance of innocence. Her story about the missing nanny, Zani the nanny, only grew more far-fetched as the investigation progressed. There was no record of a nanny by that name, and her supposed whereabouts were impossible to trace. Casey's version of events, while compelling to the untrained ear, lacked the details and consistency needed to be taken seriously. She claimed that she had last seen Kaylee months before, a statement that contradicted her earlier account of what had happened. In the midst of all this deception, something else was becoming increasingly clear. Casey was not just lying to the police. She was lying to herself. She had convinced herself, over time, that her web of lies was the truth, that she could manipulate the situation to her advantage. What she hadn't realized, however, was that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how much one tries to suppress it. The question that haunts anyone who follows the Casey Anthony case is simple, yet terrifying. What drove a mother to commit such a horrific crime? What was it that pushed Casey Anthony to take the life of her 2-year-old daughter, Kaylee, and then weave a web of lies to cover it up? To understand the tragedy that unfolded, we must first look beyond the surface, into the deeper motivations that guided Casey's actions. At the heart of this case is a woman who seemed, on the outside, to have it all: youth, beauty, and a child she claimed to love. But beneath this facade was a young woman trapped by an overwhelming sense of control and an unrelenting desire for attention. Casey's psychological state was far more complicated than simple irresponsibility or a temporary lapse in judgment. It was the culmination of a deep-seated narcissism, delusion, and emotional immaturity that guided her actions, leading her to believe that she could escape the consequences of her crime. This deep resentment manifested in the way she acted after Kaylee's disappearance. Instead of searching for her child, Casey carried on with her life as though nothing had happened, continuing to party, meet new men, and live freely. To Casey, the thought of being tied down by her daughter's needs was simply too much to handle. Her desire for freedom and a life without responsibility became stronger than her attachment to her own flesh and blood. The tragedy of Kaylee's death can be seen, in part, as the ultimate expression of Casey's need to escape the stifling constraints of motherhood. In her mind, Kaylee represented an obstacle, an unwanted responsibility that she could no longer manage. For a woman like Casey, who was unable to separate her need for attention and her inability to form healthy relationships from her own desires, the murder of her daughter became a way to regain control, to regain the life she felt she deserved. The sad irony is that Casey believed she could live her life again, free from the burden of motherhood, even if it meant taking the life of the one person who had been her entire world. At the core of Casey's motivations was an overpowering sense of narcissism. Narcissism is defined by an excessive need for admiration, a lack of empathy for others, and a tendency to view the world through a self-centered lens. In many ways, Casey Anthony's life revolved around her need for validation. She craved attention, not just from her family and friends but from the outside world. The image of herself as a loving, caring mother was not just for her daughter's benefit, it was a performance for the world to see. She crafted a persona that allowed her to feel important, special, and admired. The desire to uphold this image became more important than the truth itself. When things started to unravel, Casey's need to maintain control over her narrative led her to lie, manipulate, and deceive everyone around her. Casey's narcissistic tendencies extended beyond just seeking attention. They were also tied to her lack of empathy for others. Throughout the entire investigation, Casey showed a startling lack of genuine distress over her daughter's disappearance. Her actions, partying, drinking, and spending time with friends, painted a picture of a woman who was more concerned with her own needs than the life of her own child. This lack of empathy was a critical factor that made her capable of committing the most heinous act imaginable. Her narcissistic mindset allowed her to separate herself from the reality of what had happened, viewing her daughter's death as a tragic but necessary consequence of her own self-interest. As the investigation into Caylee Anthony's disappearance wore on, the cracks in Casey Anthony's story grew wider. What had initially appeared to be a mother's desperate plea for help quickly transformed into a saga of deceit, manipulation, and falsehoods, a tangled web so complex that the truth would only emerge after relentless digging and relentless questioning. It became clear to investigators and the public alike that Casey's narrative was nothing but a series of calculated lies meant to conceal the unthinkable truth. From the very beginning, Casey's story was filled with inconsistencies. She claimed that her daughter had been kidnapped by a nanny, a figure who, as it was soon discovered, didn't even exist. Yet, she didn't immediately report her daughter's disappearance. She waited over a month, leading many to question the timeline of events. The most disturbing part was that during this critical period, Casey continued to live her life as if everything was normal. Instead of frantically searching for Caylee, she was partying, socializing, and dating new men. This lack of urgency in the search for her daughter raised red flags, but it wasn't until further investigation that the full scale of Casey's manipulations became clear. The key element of Casey's fabricated story was the mysterious Zani the nanny, the woman who, according to Casey, had kidnapped her daughter. The nanny was central to Casey's account of what had happened, yet there was one huge problem. No such nanny existed. Investigators soon discovered that Casey had made up the entire narrative, a narrative that she used to explain why Caylee was missing, why she hadn't been able to care for her daughter, and why she had failed to report the situation in a timely manner. Casey's lie about Zani was masterfully spun to mask the truth. She painted herself as a victim of circumstance, someone who had been tricked by an untrustworthy nanny, someone who was just as helpless as the rest of the world in the search for her daughter. But as the investigation continued, the lie fell apart. There was no nanny, and further investigation revealed that the timeline Casey had constructed didn't make sense. The truth was beginning to show through the cracks of her carefully crafted facade. The search for Caylee came to an abrupt and tragic end in December 2008, when Caylee's remains were found in a wooded area not far from the Anthony family's home. The discovery of her tiny, skeletal remains sent shockwaves through the nation, bringing an end to the frantic search but marking the beginning of a new, even more harrowing chapter in the case. The moment the remains were found, it became clear. Caylee had been murdered, and the person who had been responsible for that murder was the person closest to her, Casey Anthony. The moment the remains were recovered, investigators turned their attention squarely on Casey. Despite her repeated denials, the evidence began to mount. The lies she had told, the strange behavior she had exhibited, and the inconsistencies in her story were all leading to one undeniable conclusion. Casey Anthony was directly responsible for her daughter's death. The lies continued to spiral. Each time Casey was confronted with evidence, she crafted a new story, a new explanation. At one point, she claimed that Kaylee drowned in the family pool and that she panicked and didn't know how to handle the situation. But even this version of events seemed far-fetched, given the circumstances. With every new twist and turn, it became clearer that Casey's attempt to manipulate the investigation was not only failing, but unraveling with greater intensity. The case of Casey Anthony was not just a trial, it was a spectacle, a media frenzy that captivated the nation and exposed the dark undercurrents of family dynamics, deception, and a desperate desire for control. When Casey Anthony was finally charged with the murder of her 2-year-old daughter, Kaylee, the world watched with bated breath. The evidence seemed overwhelming, the lies she had spun for months were unraveling, and the accusations were as horrifying as they were clear. But the trial that followed was one of the most publicized, complex, and emotionally charged legal battles in modern history, a battle not just for justice, but for the truth that no one seemed to be able to grasp. From the moment the trial began in May 2011, it became an all-consuming media event. Cameras captured every moment, every emotional outburst, and every development in the courtroom. Casey Anthony was not just a defendant, she became a symbol. To some, she was a cold-blooded killer. To others, a mother who had been wrongly accused. The world became divided. News outlets around the globe plastered her face on every screen, dissecting every detail of her life, her demeanor, and her actions in the courtroom. Every moment of the trial was analyzed, reanalyzed, and dissected by pundits, experts, and ordinary viewers alike. As the trial progressed, Casey's defense team crafted a story designed to shift the blame from Casey to everyone but her. Their argument was that Kaylee's death was accidental, that she had drowned in the family pool, and that Casey had panicked, covering up the accident in fear of the consequences. This defense was coupled with a shocking claim that Casey's father, George Anthony, had somehow been involved in the cover-up, a claim that sought to undermine the credibility of the family and deflect the blame onto others. On the other side, the prosecution argued that Casey had murdered her daughter in cold blood. They painted a chilling picture of a mother who had planned and executed her daughter's death as a way to escape the burden of motherhood. The prosecution emphasized the lies Casey told, the strange behavior she exhibited, and the forensic evidence that pointed to the murder. The key pieces of evidence presented in court were the decomposing smell in Casey's car, the search history on her computer, and the lack of any credible explanation for Kaylee's death. The prosecution was adamant that Casey had been motivated by a desire to regain the life she had before becoming a mother, a life of partying, socializing, and seeking attention. To them, Casey's actions were not the result of a tragic accident, they were calculated and deliberate. But perhaps the most damning testimony came from those who knew Casey best, her family. As the trial unfolded, Casey's parents, Cindy and George, were forced to face the reality of their daughter's actions. The emotional toll it took on the family was evident as each witness took the stand, recounting their experiences with Casey and revealing the deep dysfunction within the family. The trial exposed the rawness of a family torn apart by lies, manipulation, and betrayal. The trial concluded in July 2011, and after hours of deliberation, the jury reached their decision. The world held its breath. In a shocking turn of events, Casey Anthony was acquitted of first-degree murder and aggravated manslaughter, though she was convicted of 4 counts of providing false information to law enforcement. The jury found that there was not enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Casey had intentionally killed her daughter. The ruling was met with shock, outrage, and disbelief. The saga of Casey Anthony is one that continues to haunt those who followed the case, long after the verdict was rendered. Kaylee Anthony, a bright, innocent child whose life was tragically cut short, became the symbol of a much larger story about deception, family dysfunction, and the failure to protect the most vulnerable among us. The case left the public asking one disturbing question: how could a mother, a person who should have been a child's greatest protector, betray her own flesh and blood? The Casey Anthony case will forever remain a cautionary tale about the fragility of trust, the dark side of self-interest, and the painful reality that sometimes those who are supposed to protect us are the very ones who betray us.